During the 80s, our task was to develop all the pieces necessary for the complete GNU system, which we couldn't find already available. Of course, we were constantly looking around for free programs that were available already, because that could reduce the size of the job we had to do before we had a running system. People were saying, this is a nice idea, but it's such a big job, we don't think you could ever finish it. Well, I had hoped we could finish it, but they were right, it was a big job. So we could not afford the attitude of not invented here. We had to be willing to use any existing program that was free and more or less adequate for the job. Thus, for instance, I decided to use the X window system. It wasn't exactly what I would have preferred, but it was free software and it was adequate. We also found some other programs that we could use, but that still left lots of pieces that nobody else developed. We had to develop them or recruit someone to develop them. In October 1985, we started the Free Software Foundation, figuring that the popularity of GNU Emacs would show people that the GNU project really could produce useful software, that it was not just talk. Then maybe they'd be willing to give some money. So we started a tax-exempt organization. People in the US could take a tax deduction if they gave, in order to raise money to promote free software and specifically to develop parts of GNU. And at that point, the foundation took over from me the business of selling copies of GNU Emacs, and the orders increased and increased, and for quite a number of years the foundation was bringing in a substantial amount of money from that, and we got to the point where we had several programmers working full-time. And they developed some important parts of the system, including, for example, the command interpreter, the shell, that you normally type at if you're using a command line interface, and the C library, which is the interface between all of user mode programs and the kernel. These were both components written by staff of the Free Software Foundation. We also hired, in some cases, technical writers to produce manuals. But most of the software was developed by volunteers, and there were many, many volunteers. There were even some full-time volunteers. I'm a full-time volunteer for the foundation because it does not pay me. You see, when the foundation first had enough money to hire one person, I, as the president, had to decide how to spend it. In particular, I had to decide whether the foundation should pay me a salary, pay Stallman a salary, or hire a different person. But it was my responsibility to spend the money in the most effective way possible. And I realized that paying Stallman a salary would be like throwing the money away, because we could get Stallman to work for nothing. So it was therefore obviously my duty to hire another person instead. And this rule continues to this day. The foundation does not pay me a salary. I'm a full-time volunteer. This is important because I'm asking you to volunteer. And in order to ask you to do it, I have to do it. I'm only asking you to do the same thing that I've been doing for many years. There are other full-time volunteers as well, but most of them are getting paid by somebody to do it. They're not getting paid by us, so from our point of view, they're volunteers. But in fact, that's how they make their living. There are also, of course, by now, many thousands of part-time volunteers who donate their time and are not paid for it at all. The interesting thing that we have shown in the free software community is that you don't have to assume that developing software requires money. Well, if you want a certain program to be written this month, very likely you do have to pay to get someone to do that. But what we've shown is that people who are not getting paid will produce a broad spectrum of useful software that together can do a lot of things. So when we think about how society gets its software, it's a mistake to assume that this always has to be based on money. People used to say to me, If the software is free, then nobody can be paid to work on it, so nobody will work on it. Clearly, they were being confused about the two different meanings of the word free. But never mind that. They were still making the assumption that there was no possible motive for anyone to develop software, whether it's free software or not, except money. So let's compare their theory with observed fact. Today, there are around 1 million people contributing to free software. So let's look around and see what kind of motives these people actually have. Human nature, of course, is very complex. One person can have multiple motives for a single act at the same time. So some of the motives that I have encountered for developing free software include political idealism, trying to make the world a better place, to fight for freedom. That's one. Another is fun. Programming is tremendous fun. I sure wish, even though I'm glad I'm doing the work I do today, which is promoting the philosophy of free software. That's what's most needed. I often miss programming because programming is so much fun. It's so much fun, in fact, that many people who have full-time jobs programming like to work on free software in their spare time, because that way they're working on whatever project they choose in the way they choose, and that makes it more fun. Of course, not everybody feels this way, but a lot of the best programmers find programming fun, and those are the people whose help we want most in the area of programming. Another motive is to be appreciated. If your free program is used by 1% of our community, that's hundreds of thousands of users. That's a lot of people who are grateful to you. It feels really good. Another motive is to have a professional reputation. Hundreds of thousands of people using your free program and saying it's good is something you can show to an employer and say, see, I'm a good programmer. You don't even have to go to school. The FSF once hired somebody who was around 17 years old just after he graduated from high school because he was such a good programmer. He'd already been volunteering for us for a few years. I didn't care if he had a college degree. I just cared if he could do good work. Another motive is feeling gratitude. If you have been using our community's software for years and appreciating how good it is, how much it has helped you use computers, then when you write a useful program, that is your opportunity to give something back. Or we might say to pay it forward, because you're not giving a compensation to the specific developers of the programs you use, but you're adding to what our community gives to others. So you're paying it forward instead of paying it back. But it still is a way you can return something to the community so it responds to a feeling of gratitude. Another motive is hatred for Microsoft. I think that's a rather shallow motive, but factually speaking, it exists. It's shallow because it's a mistake to focus too much on any one company as the problem we're trying to solve. Yes, Microsoft is a part of the problem. So is Adobe, so is Oracle, and many other companies contribute to the problem as well. The problem we're trying to solve is non-free software. Microsoft has subjugated more users than anybody else. But that's not because the others aren't trying. They just haven't managed to subjugate as many users as Microsoft has. So they're not really better. The danger is if you focus on Microsoft alone, if you start thinking that the problem is Microsoft, you have now fallen into the confusion of forgetting that the others are also part of the problem. And you start thinking that anybody who competes with Microsoft is good, that anything that reduces Microsoft's success is good. And that includes some non-free software. So it's actually bad. Just because it's competing with Microsoft doesn't mean it's treating our freedom with respect. So we shouldn't be distracted from the issue of freedom in our community to focus on Microsoft's success or failure. So this is a shallow reason, but there are people who contribute to our community for this reason, and their contributions are real, even if the reasons are not the wisest reasons. And then another motive that some people have for the free software development that they do is money. Once I stopped selling tapes of GNU Emacs, I had to find another way to make a living. So I began taking commissions to make changes in the free software I had already released. So when I said that you could go to various companies and say, how much will you charge to make this change, that's not just theoretical. I actually made my living that way for many years in the 80s, and there are lots of people doing it today. I stopped because I got a big prize and I didn't have to do it at the time anymore. But otherwise, I would have continued. So the clients who paid me to make changes in free programs, they knew, because I told them, that when it was done, I would put these changes into the standard release and they would become free software. But it was still worthwhile for them to pay me because they wanted that software to exist. And they had no reason to expect anybody to write that particular improvement just for his own wishes. They knew that to get that particular job done, they had to pay someone. And they chose me because I had written the base program, and so they figured I was an expert and I could do a good job and fast. So even though I charged them a lot of money per hour, they figured I would get the job done in fewer hours and that it was a good arrangement. And in fact, my income went up at this point to the extent that I started turning away work some of the time. Once I had made enough money to live on, plus an equal amount to save, plus an equal amount for taxes, I thought, why should I spend any more time working for pay this year? And I was actually making a living with 7 weeks of paid work per year. Of course, this was possible because I was doing unpaid work all the rest of the year, producing free software and improving it, which is why people wanted to use it and wanted to adapt it. But the rest of the work I was doing that for the cause, for the sake of having a free operating system. I would have done it anyway. So money was not my primary motive in working on free software. But it was an important part of my motive for making that particular change that somebody was paying me to make. If they hadn't paid me to make that change, I would have been making some other change which was more useful to more people. Instead, I made the change that was useful to that one particular client. So, as I explained, one action can have multiple motives, and one of the motives for that particular job that I did was money. And nowadays there are lots of people doing free software businesses which often involve, some of the time, extending the free software that's available to the community. You see, if you're thinking of using a non-free program, you have two choices: take it or leave it. If you take it, you get it exactly the way it is with whatever bugs it has, whatever malicious features or poorly designed features it may have. And the other choice is don't use it. With free software, of course, you have those two alternatives, but you have others in between as well, which are use the program but make changes of various different sizes. So it's like buying a building. You know, if a company buys a building, they can use it exactly the way it is, or they could decide they don't want to buy that building, or in between they have the possibility of buying it but then calling in some carpenters and plumbers and making some change. They could make small changes or big changes. Of course, big changes cost more. Which of these alternatives is best for you in any given situation? It depends. But it's good to have those other options. With free software, it's the same. The business has the option of making changes bigger or smaller, and they can choose among these the option that's best for them. And this creates a large amount of free software business. People sometimes ask how free software might affect employment. Well, the first thing to note is that it won't affect employment very much. Because if you look at all computer-related employment, programming is a small fraction of that. And of that, most of it is developing custom software, software for one client to use internally. A small fraction of it is developing software for release to the public. That's the size of employment that we could imagine perhaps might go away. A small fraction of a small fraction of the computer field. So this employment might perhaps go away, but not necessarily, because a considerable fraction of software development is paid for by governments. And they could just as well decide to make it free software, and it'll still be the same money coming from the same place to produce the same software. There are occasional exceptions. You know, maybe there's some software that goes into a weapon that they don't want to publish at all. But if the software is going to be available to the public somehow, they can make it free software. Meanwhile, switching to free software creates the opportunity for other employment of a new kind. That is, employment adapting software for clients. If a business that wants to, or other organization, government, NGO, whatever, wants to use a program, but they don't choose to use it exactly the way it is, they choose to adapt it, that means they're going to pay somebody to make changes. And that creates new employment. Which one will be bigger, I don't know. Whether switching to free software means, you know, it could mean a little less employment, it could mean a little more, it could mean a lot more, it could mean no change at all. I won't try to predict. What I will say is, it can't mean a big loss of employment. That's impossible, because the jobs that you could imagine might go away are so few compared with the entire computer field. So we don't have anything to worry about as far as the effects on society. And as far as development of software is concerned, we don't need to worry about economic issues in developing software. We've already proved that just by developing so much free software. The whole world has not switched to free software, and already we're developing tremendous amounts. So people who worry about whether free software, or the free software community, can provide enough software, that's like worrying whether airplanes could really fly. So, during the 80s, our job, our mission, was to find or develop all the parts we needed for the GNU system. Eventually, when we had a lot of them, we made a list of what was missing. Once that was smaller than a list of what we had. And that was called the GNU task list. We published it and said to people, if you want to help, pick one of these tasks and do it. By the early 90s, we had almost all the components we needed, but there was one major gap. We didn't have a kernel. Now, when you need all of when there are a set of things and you need all of them, a priori, it doesn't matter what order you do them in. You could do them in any order. And that was our situation. So I tried to optimize the order. I was looking for some way we could get either all or part of the kernel from someone else to reduce the job we had to do. And I found out about a microkernel called Mach that was a funded project at Carnegie Mellon University. And then I had the idea that we would use Mach, but Mach didn't do the entire job of the kernel. It did the lower level part. So we would have to write programs to do the other part, and together they would make our kernel. I figured if we only had to do the top level, that would be less work. In addition, we could run those programs as user programs and debug them as user programs, which should make it easier. So I thought that this would enable us to have a working kernel faster and would also give us a more advanced, powerful design. Well, it is a more advanced, powerful design, but it turned out it took years to get it to run. I don't entirely understand why it took so long. I personally was not the one doing it, but it's a fact. Fortunately, we did not have to wait for our kernel, which we call the GNU herd, to be working, because in 1991, a college student in Finland decided, just because he was interested in kernels, that he would write a kernel. And he had it running using the traditional monolithic design, one big program that's all one connected thing and does all the jobs. He had it running, barely running, in less than a year, which was amazing. Initially, it was not free software, but in early '92, he decided to re-release it under the GNU General Public License. So it was free software then. At that point, it was possible, by fitting his kernel into the gap in the GNU system, to make a complete free system, and people did that. We didn't do that. Linus Torvalds never contacted us and said, I have a kernel, would you like to use it? But he did announce it elsewhere, and people who knew about his kernel thought, let's try to find all the other programs we need so that we could have a whole system we could actually run. So they looked around, and lo and behold, everything they needed was already available. What good fortune, they said. But this was no accident. The reason that all the rest of the system was already there is we'd been working on that for most of a decade, making all these components and making them work together. So in fact, what they were doing was adding Linux to the incomplete GNU system, because this kernel's name is Linux, you see. So they were adding Linux to GNU, making a system that you could call GNU plus Linux. But they didn't recognize that that's what they were doing. They thought they were starting with Linux and adding these many other components to make a system. They didn't realize that all the rest was GNU. So they called the whole thing a Linux system. And that's how the confusion got started. That's how it is that tens of millions of people are now using a variant of the GNU system, and they don't know it's a variant of the GNU system. They don't know it's a system that we've been working on for 20 years specifically for the sake of freedom to cooperate. They think the whole system is Linux, and that it was all started in 1991 by Linus Torvalds. Now, why does that matter, this confusion? Well, it hurts our egos, but that's not really an important thing. The thing that matters is that Linus Torvalds doesn't agree with our philosophy. He doesn't share our vision of living in freedom. He happens to think that non-free software is legitimate. He doesn't like the idea of making technical decisions based on social consequences. He thinks a technical decision should be made for technical reasons, to keep the technology pure. Well, I can't really speak for him. I hope I haven't made a mistake. As you can see, I don't agree with those views, but he has a right to his views, and he has a right to advocate them. What I think is unfair is when our larger work is attributed to him and to his views and becomes a platform for spreading his views instead of ours. Most of the users of the GNU system think it was developed by somebody who wanted to have fun. Well, having fun is a perfectly good motive. I have fun programming too. But the reason we have a complete free operating system is because of another motive, because of people who were determined to work as long as it took so that we could live in freedom. And the users need to know this, because they need to think about the issue of freedom, or they're likely to lose their freedom. And this is something that is much more general than the area of software. We can see in all areas of life, if you have freedom but you don't value it, you're likely to lose it. Because people will offer to take your freedom off your hands and give you in exchange something else that's attractive or convenient. Maybe they'll say they'll make you more safe, or maybe they offer you a competitive advantage, whatever it is, or maybe just a more convenient system, all you have to do is pay some money and give up your freedom, and you will have these attractive advantages. And society is constantly faced with that kind of temptation to throw everything away. My country suffered a terrible attack in 2001 from its own leaders who took away our freedom in the name of keeping us safe from terrorism. Now, I thought that people were supposed to give up their lives to defend their freedom, not the opposite. The opposite is stupid. After people fought for freedom so hard, to throw it away just to save your life, that's cowardice. My country was founded for the sake of freedom and still talks about being the champion of freedom, but it's not so anymore, and that makes me terribly sad when I think about it. At least in India, when they tried to pass anti-terrorism laws, at least there was a fight. It still happened, but you can be proud that at least the opposition in the Indian parliament fought against it. In the US Congress, almost everybody voted for it, to take away our freedom. And how we'll ever get it back, I don't know. Well, that applies to these obscure issues of freedom for users of software, just as it applies to freedom from having the police just spy on you all the time. It applies to any issue of freedom. But in the area of freedom for computer users, we face the problem that most users have never even heard of the issue. That's our first mission. If we want users to stand up for their freedom, we've got to teach them what it is, what the issue of freedom is. And here, unfortunately, most of the free software community is not participating. Most of them talk about the GNU/Linux system, calling it Linux, and presenting it only as a practical alternative, suggesting only practical advantages for it. Well, those practical advantages are part of the reason to switch to it. But if people don't talk about the ethical and political reasons, we're not teaching people to value freedom. And people who don't value freedom can easily give it up. They might switch to a free operating system for practical reasons, and the next thing you know, they're installing some non-free software on top of it because they don't know they're losing anything. And this happens quite often. There are many people who are fans of the GNU/Linux system. And they work hard to try to make the system more popular. And they think it's good when some non-free program runs on top of the system. They actually applaud the developers and say, thank you for supporting, they usually call it Linux. Say, thank you for supporting Linux because you'll help us make Linux more popular. And when they say Linux, they're really talking about a variant of the GNU system. So they are trying to support our project by making our work more popular. But that's missing the point. We didn't do this work just so it would be popular. There's a more important thing at stake here, which is our freedom. We did this work so that we and you could live in freedom. And they're willing to sacrifice the freedom to gain popularity. They're willing to endorse a non-free program and call it a good thing because it might make our system more popular. Well, when they do that, what are they saying to people? What are they teaching people? They're teaching people that non-free software is fine. It's okay. How are those people going to understand why they should stand up for freedom if we never tell them that? So, although our community is growing and our software is also doing more jobs, our community is weak in some ways because it's full of people who have never recognized this as an issue of freedom. People who are ready to choose at any given moment whatever program is most convenient for today's job, who are looking at the question in short-term ways. You find governments saying, we will use either free software or non-free, whatever does the job most easily today. But that is short-sighted. Governments should be looking above all at how to direct society towards freedom and strength and happiness. And that means that that's the government's overall mission. Of course, individual government departments have particular jobs to do. But while they do these jobs and try to do so efficiently, they should not forget the government's overall purpose. Which means that when they start doing a job using computers, they should use free software, because that leads society in the direction of goodwill and development and independence and strength. The use of non-free software does not permit development. It's the opposite of development, because it's dependency. It's permanent dependency. And the only way to escape from this dependency is to stop using the non-free software. So anytime governments spread the use of non-free software in society, they are making society more dependent. Society is in a pit, and they are digging the pit deeper. What they should be doing is digging the path to get out. Governments have a duty to use free software for their work, because they have a duty to maintain control over the government's data on behalf of the citizens. Governments operate on lots of data for their dealings with the public, and it's the government's responsibility to do this on behalf of the public, which means that government must never allow any private party to get control over what's done with this data. And the only way to make sure the government has full control over what it does with its data is by using free software all the time. But above all, it's the schools that have to use free software, because the schools are training the next generation. And schools in India today have a choice. They can either train people to be dependent on non-free software, to be under the thumb of the non-free software developers, perhaps for their whole lives, or they can train people to use free software and to recognize freedom and defend it. Which one is the healthy path? Clearly, society is better off if people are not dependent on a company, a particular company, typically even a foreign one. And you can see this even in the tremendous drain of money that pours away in license fees every year and is likely to get more and more. Right now, of course, most individuals in India who have computers are using unauthorized copies. But the developers are taking steps to make that impossible. So you can expect this drain of money to turn into a flood of money, and it's going to get bigger every year. This is a very shallow reason, but it is significant for a poor country. It creates part of the digital divide. Part of the digital divide is natural. It's because computers cost money and connectivity costs money. But added to that is the artificial part of the digital divide, created by the artificial scarcity of the software you need to run the computer. Free software eliminates that part of the digital divide. And if you only have the other parts to deal with, all your efforts at solving it can go further. But there are deeper reasons why schools must use free software, must offer the students free software to use. One of them is for the sake of education. Some people in their teens want to learn all about software. And at that point, a lot of them are going to want to know, how does this program I'm using actually work? If they're using non-free software, the answer is, it's a secret. You're not allowed to know such things. Don't ask. But if the school's running free software, then the teacher can say, I'm glad you're interested. Here's the source code. This is exactly how the program does that job. You can learn everything. And then you could learn even more by trying making changes in that source code. Some people are natural-born programmers. Writing code is immediately obvious to them. And we still have to learn good judgment in how to write clear, quality code. And the way you learn that is by reading a lot of code and writing a lot of code. It's like learning to be a good writer of a human language. With non-free software, there's nothing for you to read. I used to see people graduating from college around 1990, and they had never seen a program that wasn't a toy, that wasn't a classroom exercise, because the real programs were secret. But today, anyone in India can have the same kind of opportunity that I had only because I was at MIT. In 1971, the only way to get that opportunity was to go over to MIT. But today, all you need is a PC. Install GNU/Linux on it, and you have the same opportunity to learn to write system software by reading it and changing it. Think of a new feature to add. You take a big program and you make a small change. As a beginner, you couldn't write a big program yourself, not very well, but you can write a small change. And by doing that, you start to understand the issues about how to make a big program clear. When you've done that enough times, you understand how to write a big program and do a good job. This opportunity can now be available in every school. Schools should say to the kids, if you bring software to school, you may not keep it for yourself. You must let the other kids copy it. That's a rule. Of course, the school has to follow its own rule. So the school should only bring free software to school as well. And this way we can teach people the habit of helping each other out, make a society that's more livable, more kind. When companies offer gratis copies of non-free software to schools in India, they're trying to lead the students into a trap. They're trying to get the students hooked to make them dependent. It's the same reason why tobacco companies used to like giving away gratis packs of cigarettes to kids, so that they would grow up and be dependent on tobacco. And for the same reason, schools should refuse to go along with this. So, today, we've made a great beginning. We have tens of thousands of users. We have many free programs that do a lot of jobs. Where do we go from here? Of course, we need to develop more programs to do other jobs. And we need to show the other computer users in the world that they can live in freedom also. But today, we have something that we never had before. We have enemies, powerful organizations trying to stop us from developing free software. We want to serve the public. They don't want to let us serve the public. In the US, there are 2 different laws that each prohibits various kinds of free software. One of these laws is called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, and it prohibits free software for certain specific a certain range of jobs, which is accessing accessing encrypted media. It prohibits free software for a specific range of jobs, which is access to encrypted media. For instance, there's a free program that you can use to play a DVD, but this program is illegal in the US. It has been censored, banned. My computer used to have a DVD player, which I couldn't get software to use. That software that would enable me to use it is illegal in the US. If you buy a DVD, it's lawful for you to put it into your computer and play the film, but the free software to do it has been prohibited. Of course, that's a rather narrow range of jobs, but they're important jobs. Lots of users want to play DVDs. Lots of users want to listen to a real audio stream or a real video stream. And free software to do that is prohibited as well. So these problems are a major obstacle to liberating the rest of the users. Of course, that law in the U.S. doesn't affect people in other countries, but the U.S. is trying its best to impose such laws on other countries, often doing so through trade negotiations. The U.S. was trying to impose that very restriction on the entire Western Hemisphere through the free trade area of the Americas, but it was blocked by Brazil, a country where the government now gives strong support to free software. The other law that the U.S. has, which prohibits many different kinds of free software, is applying patent law to software ideas. Now, it's important to recognize that this is not a matter of patenting programs, because each patent covers an idea, and each program combines many different ideas to do a job. Writing a substantial program inevitably means you use lots of ideas which then are embodied in the code of the program. Some of them you may not even have been aware of. You may not have noticed that these 20 lines of code embody a certain idea. You just wrote them. But if somebody has a patent saying nobody's allowed to implement that idea, you can still get sued for having written those 20 lines. I think the record for shortness of a program that would get you sued is 3 lines on the PDP-10 way back when. 3 lines of code was enough to do something that was patented, and you could get sued for it. Of course, those 3 lines in your program would be together with maybe 100,000 other lines, which might implement 200 other different patented ideas, and you might get sued 200 times by 200 different people. So software patents, as it happens, are not just bad for free software. They're bad for all software developers. It's a terrible, stupid policy. It makes software development like crossing a minefield, because at each design decision, there's a certain chance you'll step on a patent, and you never know when it's going to happen. But when it does happen, it can explode and destroy your project. So it's important to make sure that your country doesn't have software patents, that it does not follow the mistake of the U.S. Now, the impact of software patents on the free software community is that there are various programs we don't have and can't have, at least not in the U.S. and not in those other countries that allow such patents. And this can affect any kind of software. For any kind of job, this problem can occur. And the danger is that users who haven't been taught to value freedom, when they choose what software to use, if they choose solely based on the immediate practical benefits, they will look at free software and say, this is bad, it doesn't have this feature. And why don't we have the feature? Because the government said we're not allowed to have the feature. But the users don't think of it that way. They just say, the free software is inferior, I'm going to choose to be a slave. So part of resisting this problem is teaching users to recognize that freedom itself is something that they need. But part of it is organizing politically to make sure that as many countries as possible reject patenting software ideas. Why make software development like a minefield? Developing software is hard enough. There's no need to make it even harder by saying there are all these things you have to avoid doing. So these are 2 of the dangers that we face, of the forms of opposition that we face, in addition, there is the problem that some hardware has secret specifications. There are companies that will sell you a piece of hardware that you could use in your PC, but they won't tell you how to run it. The specifications are secret. Instead, they offer you a non-free program to run that hardware with. Well, if you don't mind giving up your freedom, that solves the problem, right? But if you do value your freedom, that's not acceptable at all. But it's hard to write free software to replace those non-free drivers if we can't figure out how to talk to the hardware. So it's a hard job, which often involves, watching the signals that go back and forth to the hardware in order to figure out the right commands to use. So what we need to do is to organize and put pressure on these hardware companies to say that you're not really supporting our community if you invite us to use a non-free program. So start really cooperating with us. We're not asking you to write the program. Just publish the specifications of your hardware. We'll write the program. We'll support it. We'll be completely satisfied if you just publish the specs, or just even show us the specs. Let us look at them and write the free program. As long as you let us write the program, then that's enough cooperation. That's all we ask of you. And sometimes we convince one, but there are still some who refuse to cooperate. But the biggest threat we face is from treacherous computing. That's the name we call it. The proponents of the scheme call it trusted computing. This is a conspiracy of many large corporations who aim to impose a change in the design of all computers. I say it's a conspiracy. You might wonder how I know. The answer is it's not a secret. They admit it. You can go look it up and see that companies such as Intel and AMD and IBM and Hewlett-Packard and Sun and Microsoft and Transmeta have all agreed to participate in this plan, which they call trusted computing. But that name is deceptive. What do they mean? They mean that an application developer can trust your computer to obey him and not you. So from your point of view, it's treacherous computing, because it means your computer will not obey you. And that's the whole point. This redesign of all computers is intended to give the software developers more control and give you less control. But it's not being done as a proposed law, although they do take advantage of the laws in some countries that make it illegal to bypass the scheme. What they intend is simply to get all the computer manufacturers to participate in this scheme, or most of them at least, and then they expect to publish data in formats that can only be accessed using the special treacherous computing hardware. And then for instance, they expect to publish music and movies that way, and books. And so then they figure that the users will all say, I want treacherous computing. I want my computer to betray me so that I can access these published works. And that way they figure that, people would still be allowed to make computers that don't do this, but nobody will. And yes, we will still be allowed to develop free operating systems, but it will be impossible on a free operating system to access any of those publications. So the idea is that free software will appear so inadequate that it will die. Now, how are we going to resist this? I'm hoping that some governments will actively sponsor the development of hardware that bypasses, that defeats the plot, and make this available fairly cheaply to the public. So if a government supports us strongly enough in rejecting treacherous computing, that method can be used. I also hope that governments will require that anyone who sells treacherous computing hardware will actually give the user full control over it, which will defeat the purpose. Because the point of treacherous computing is that it doesn't fully give the user control over what the hardware is going to do. So there are ways governments can help us if we get politically organized enough to convince them. So what will the outcome be? Will free software triumph? That's up to you. We don't know what's going to happen. We're in a struggle for freedom. If enough people decide freedom is important, we can win. If people don't care about freedom, history shows we're likely to lose. So I'm going to do my best, and I hope that you'll join me. But sometimes people accuse me of having a holier-than-thou attitude, and they criticize that. Well, they're right. I am holy. I'm a saint. It's my job to be holy. So let me now present my alter ego. It's a bit slower doing this nowadays. There. I am Saint Ignucius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as a text editor, which became a way of life for many users and ultimately a religion. We even have a great schism between two rival versions of Emacs, and now we have saints as well. Fortunately, no gods. To be a member of the Church of Emacs, you must recite the Confession of the Faith. You must say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. You don't have to be ashamed of laughing out loud. It's good to get it on into the microphone. And the Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with some other churches I won't name, because to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. So if you're looking for a church in which to be holy, you might consider ours. But it does require making a moral commitment to live a life of purity. You must vow, you must make the vow and carry it out to exorcise the evil proprietary operating systems that possess all the computers under your direct practical control, and then install a wholly free operating system to replace it. Of course, holy can be spelled in more than one way. And then only install free software on top of that. If you make this vow and carry it out, then you too will be a saint, and you too may eventually have a halo if you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. Sometimes people ask me, in the Church of Emacs, is it a sin to use VI? The answer is that using a free version of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. And sometimes people ask if my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous existence. So with that, thank you, and I'll now accept questions. So how should we deal with questions? Is there a microphone to give to people who have questions? Okay, raise your hand if you have a question. There are not that many of you, so each of you is going to have to work extra hard in coming up with questions. Okay, to get the microphone so that you can be heard.
No, this political idealism which drives this movement, of course, is very laudable and would appeal to anybody with any ethical sense. But I was just wondering if it is partly successful because of the nature of the entity you are dealing with, namely software. Because
of course,
this kind of thing actually is true for many other, for example, medicine.
Yes and not really. You see, I think it's not true for medicine. You can't copy drugs. There are no copiers. If you have a copy of a program, you can make another copy easily. You just type copy.
What I meant was, in a different sense, that the knowledge regarding drugs is a very important knowledge of great benefit to, but it is very highly copyrighted.
No, it's not copyrighted at all. It's patented.
Yeah,
And patents and copyrights are
it's patented.
Yeah, I'd like you to let me respond to this because I think that these two issues are totally different.
Yeah, but
They're
completed. It's patented. No, copyright was the wrong word. It's patented, but this patent is of very. It means extremely costly medicines for.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
But these issues are totally different.
Yeah, they're not identical, but they are. I thought they're.
No, they're completely different. You see, the issue of patents on medicine is a very important issue. It's an issue of life and death for millions of people. But it's a totally different issue because it's solely an issue of price. If it's about whether companies can be allowed to make the drugs cheaply. But you and I can't copy these drugs. That's not how drugs are made. There are no copiers. You know, in the movie Forbidden Planet, Robbie the robot could copy anything you poured into it. It could copy a drug, but that's just science fiction. In reality, there is no drug copier that you can just pour some drug in and it'll make more of that. Drugs are made through specially designed factories, and you and I can't do it no matter what. So these patents are not a restriction on your activities or my activities, not directly. They're a restriction only on the activities of some large, expensive factories. So the issue is solely a matter of the price that you and I can buy the drugs for. So it's in some ways that makes it a very simple issue. This does not mean it's unimportant. As I said, it's a matter of life and death. But it's totally different from the issue of free software. That's an issue about whether you and I are free to cooperate with each other directly. That kind of issue doesn't arise for drugs. So we shouldn't make the mistake of saying that just because two issues are both important, that means they're analogous. The drug issue may be more important than the free software issue because it's life and death, but it's totally different.
I mean, the smaller companies, for instance, you said they cannot be copied. They can be copied by smaller companies in rural
But
areas.
that's different. You're using the word copy in a different way. I use medicine, but I can't copy it. If you said, could I have a copy of that pill, I can't copy it for you. In fact, nobody can. You could, in theory, set up a factory to produce more, but to directly copy a pill, that isn't so. And likewise, there's the issue of the freedom to modify it. Generally, for physical things, if you buy it, you are free to modify it. But with software, you are blocked from effectively modifying it because you don't get the source code. The feasible way to modify software is using the source code, but they deny you access to the source code, so they block you from feasibly modifying it.
I want to express a view about this question what he raised and what you answered. one thing, the objective of the both of these issues, what we were discussing, is to benefit the people, human being. So in that direction, if you think, both are similar.
At that,
Definitely, even copywriting and patent invention, both are going to benefit the people.
well, it's true that yes, anytime you think about an ethical issue, the question is, how do you benefit society? But that's a very, very basic level of similarity. And if that's the only similarity between two issues, then they're mostly different. Is somebody talking on a cell phone? I really think that, okay. Anyway, the other thing is that it is true, both copyright and patent law, although they're mostly different, both of them supposedly exist to result in a benefit for the public. But you have to ask if they really do result in benefits for the public. But this is a question which has to be looked at differently, separately for each area. Patents on medicine are a very different issue from patents on car engines, because patents on car engines are not typically a matter of life and death for anybody, but patents on medicines often are a matter of life and death. Maybe there should be patents on medicines in rich countries but not in poor countries. Maybe that would be the best system. That way, maybe that depends whether you believe that patents on medicines really stimulate research. People who study this says that they don't do a very good job of that, that new medicines that make a real improvement in our ability to treat disease typically come from government-funded research, not from private-funded research. So the whole idea that these patents are providing any kind of progress for society can be questioned. But patents in the software field have a totally different effect. Patents in software are an impediment to developing software, which is an effect that you may see to a small extent in other fields, but it's much bigger in software. And so there we're just talking about patents, and yet the effects of patents are different in different fields. Then we look at the issue of free software, which is a very different kind of issue, because that's a matter of whether you and I are free to make copies and free to change things. That's an issue that doesn't come up for physical objects, because there are no copiers for physical objects. There are no copiers for chairs, no copiers for video cameras, no copiers for clocks. There are science fiction stories where people imagine having copiers. Imagine if there were copiers for physical objects. Then the question of whether you are allowed to use these copiers to make food would become a tremendously important issue, perhaps an issue of life and death. And likewise then, the issue of whether you and I were free to use the copier to copy some medicine. I've got one pill, you know, could I make 20 more of the same thing? That would become maybe an issue of life and death. But we're not in that situation today. And these are issues where the right decision depends on the situation you're in. Someday, if we have copiers for physical objects, the situation will be different and the right thing to do will be different. But for today, we can make decisions. It's enough to make decisions that are good in today's situation. That's hard enough by itself. Get the microphone.
These powerful multinational companies, they earn their software in a very organized way. And this GNU and Linux, they develop and progress in a very different way, in different pockets.
Yes and no.
Okay.
I would say that may be less true than you might think.
Okay.
And the reason is that development of operating system software has always been like this, whereas development of very specific application software is done in a much more systematic way. But even when companies are doing the development of operating system software, even when it's non-free, they still do it a lot more like the way we do it. Although there was a change, there was an advance in how we do it. An advance which is credited to Linus Torvalds, which is the idea of inviting everybody to look at the changes every day so that immediately you can find out, you know, before you make an official release that you recommend everybody install, day by day you're making changes. And so each day you get feedback. And this way, this method leads to increased reliability of our software.
And every progress which has been made in the software needs to be registered or needs to be conveyed to the GNU organization?
Not always, because some of the programs in the system are developed by, released under the auspices of the GNU project. But there are other programs that are developed by other groups. Anybody can release a free software package. What you ought to do if you come up with an improvement is contact the developers of that package and suggest your change to them. You're not legally required to do this, but that's the way to be a good cooperating member of the community.
And rather than looking at only at governments, is there any organization or any powerful group which can help us to integrate this or to tackle this hardware problem?
I don't know offhand. I think our community needs to get more organized. With tens of millions of people, we ought to have a considerable amount of market power, but we're not organized to use it. You know, if we said to companies, if we pick one of the competitors and say to that one, we're not going to buy from you until you start cooperating with us, then we put a lot of pressure on that one. And when that one starts cooperating, then we go to the next one and say, that company's cooperating with us. If you don't start cooperating with us, we're going to tell people don't buy from you. If we got organized together, we could deploy our market power and we could convince a lot of these companies to start cooperating with us. But we're not organized. And so many of the people in our community think it's okay to use non-free drivers to run this hardware. They don't know about the problem. They don't recognize it as a problem, so they're not ready to help solve it. So I think the most important place for us to try to do something is in spreading understanding of the issue of freedom so that people recognize these problems as problems and are prepared to participate in plans to try to fix things.
In US, you said that free softwares in some cases have been prohibited. You are from US and from one of the best institutes, you have worked there, MIT. You have people there who have participated in this project. You, being in that country, are not able to convince your government to not to do so, and you are suggesting us to here in India and other developing countries.
Well, yes,
to do that.
And the reason is that maybe you have more democracy in your country than we have in ours. Politicians in the US run for office using funds that they got from companies. For instance, well, President Bush did not win the election, but nonetheless, he got money from Microsoft before he lost. So once he claimed the office of president, he made the antitrust trial go away. It was clear that that's what he was paid for. But it's not just him. The people in Congress are constantly, most of them, getting funds from companies. So they tend to do what the companies want. However, in fact, the US Congress has never openly considered the question of whether to have software patents. And the reason is that software patents exist in the US because of a court decision. The Supreme Court made a decision which does not clearly authorize software patents. And then the appeals court, so that's the Supreme Court, then the appeals court, which handles all patent issues, turned it around, arguably making a mistake, and interpreted it as allowing patenting of any kind of software idea. So Congress never decided whether to allow software patents. But recently the European Union has been trying to decide whether to have software patents, and we convinced the European Parliament to amend the directive to reject software patents. So it can be done. Unfortunately, the way the European Union works, the Parliament doesn't have very much power. If the next step with that directive is that it goes to a council with one representative from each country, and they then vote, and they can amend the decision of the Parliament, and then it goes back to Parliament, but the Parliament can only say yes or no, more or less. So the danger is that these ministers will try to override what Parliament decided, and then Parliament might accept it. So the campaign is continuing. What we've shown is that we can win battles. We can influence legislatures. What we need to do, though, in order to succeed in that, is to teach people about the issue. In the case of software patents in Europe, it's not only free software people who are opposing them. Many non-free software developers are opposing them too. And the reason is they want to be able to write software and not get sued for it. In the specific case of software patents, it's important to make common cause with all software developers, because software patents are dangerous for all software developers. They're also dangerous for large organizations that use software, because even the users can get sued for patent infringement. And when these organizations find out how bad a policy it would be, they put a lot of pressure on the government.
Among most of the software that is being developed, operating systems would be a smaller part. Today, a larger part of it would be in the applications area.
Yes.
So, how do you recommend that programmers who are interested in contributing to the effort can go about doing it? That means, could you list out a few issues? That means, okay, we understand.
Okay. First of all, you're right. And besides, we have a free operating system. So there's no point writing another. There are gaps. There are things people want to do with their operating system that we don't have yet. So those are important areas to work on. For instance, a lot of people like using the Java language, but Sun's Java platform is not free software. So to serve those users who want to run Java programs, we need to develop a free platform for that language. We've been working on it for years, and we've done a large part of it, but there's more to be done. So that's an example of one place where the operating system does need some work. However, most of the work that we need to do now is in application programs. We had to develop an operating system first because you need an operating system first. If you have an application program but no operating system, you can't run the application. You can't do anything. Whereas if you have an operating system alone, there are many things you can do with your computer, like develop software and exchange email and publish books and so on. So today we have, in fact, many free applications as well. But we need more. So yes, please do contribute. If you want to contribute by programming, writing an application in an area where we don't have one yet is a very good way to contribute. Take a look at the free software directory, which is in www.gnu.org/directory. That host is our website. You can find lots of kinds of information about free software and GNU there. /directory is a directory of almost 3,000 free software packages. So you can find out what's available, and then you can work to extend freedom into an area where it hasn't gone yet.
Just an extension to that, as you mentioned this.
I have to say the tape is running out, and it's been almost 3 hours now. So maybe it's time to call a halt. It's been a long time. So I'd like to say thank you and happy hacking. And you can cooperate with the Free Software Foundation of India in promoting free software in India.
Yeah? No, because I was wanting him to be.